Unconscious bias shows up in the smallest moments, often so quietly that people don't even realize they're carrying it with them. It hides in a glance, a tone, a hesitation, a question that didn't need to be asked, and a judgment formed long before a single word is spoken. When the businessman stepped on the plane, he wasn't just walking into a cabin, he was walking into a space filled with the assumptions others had already made about him. The flight attendant didn't pause to wonder who he might be, what he had accomplished, or why he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had earned every bit of respect a first-class ticket represents. Instead, she allowed her mind to fill in the blanks with her own silent expectations. And those expectations shaped the way she spoke to him, the way she looked at him, and the way she questioned his presence. Unconscious bias rarely appears as loud, obvious discrimination. It often shows up as small decisions: who gets greeted with warmth, who gets questioned, who gets offered help, and who gets treated like they're in the wrong place. In this case, the businessman didn't need anyone to roll out a red carpet for him. He just needed the same courtesy every passenger deserved. But because of the way he looked, the attendant assumed he couldn't possibly be in a premium seat. She assumed the ticket must be wrong, or he must be confused, or someone like him simply didn't belong in that section of the plane. These tiny assumptions add up, creating 1,000 barriers that people have to push through every day, even when they've succeeded enough to sit among the highest ranks of society. The businessman knew that feeling well, not because he invited conflict, but because he had lived through enough situations where people judged him before listening to him. He understood that these moments were rooted in years of unchallenged stereotypes, quiet prejudices passed down like traditions, and a culture that too often rewards quick judgment over understanding. When he looked at the flight attendant, he saw more than her frustration or suspicion. He saw a reflection of how society had taught her to see him. And he knew that no matter how calm or respectful he remained, her perception wouldn't shift until she was forced to confront the truth. Bias shows up in workplaces, schools, stores, and public spaces. A customer might get followed around a shop because someone assumes they can't afford the merchandise. A student might get underestimated because a teacher assumes they won't excel. A professional might get second-guessed in meetings because colleagues assume they're inexperienced. It's in the everyday choices people make without thinking, choices that slowly shape someone's experience of the world. And on that flight, the businessman felt the weight of those choices in the flight attendant's tone, the suspicion in her eyes, and the doubt in her voice. Yet unconscious bias doesn't only affect the people who are targeted by it. It also limits the person carrying it. The flight attendant didn't realize how much she was underestimating not just the businessman, but herself. By allowing her expectations to dictate her behavior, she missed the chance to show professionalism, kindness, and fairness. She allowed her assumptions to guide her actions instead of her training. And in doing so, she set herself up for a moment of shock that could have been avoided if she had simply chosen to treat him with the same respect she offered others. The businessman's calm reaction wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. He understood that reacting with anger would only reinforce the very stereotypes that caused the problem in the first place. Instead, he held his composure, choosing dignity over confrontation. And in that silence, the flight attendant's discomfort grew, because no amount of questioning could change the fact that he belonged exactly where he was seated. Bias often crumbles when it is met with undeniable truth, and she was moments away from learning that lesson for herself. Every time someone makes a snap judgment based on skin color, appearance, or background, they reveal more about their own limitations than the person they're judging. And when those biases remain unchallenged, they become habits that shape interactions, careers, and communities. The moment on that flight was just one example of how deeply rooted and quietly powerful these biases can be. The attendant thought she was enforcing rules or maintaining order, but she was acting on assumptions that had nothing to do with reality. Unconscious bias thrives in silence, in unexamined thoughts, in moments when people don't notice their own reactions. But when those moments are exposed, when someone is forced to confront the gap between their assumptions and the truth, it creates a powerful opportunity for reflection. And on that flight, that moment was coming, and it was going to unfold in a way the attendant never saw coming. The businessman's calm but powerful response to disrespect began long before he even opened his mouth. It was in the way he held his posture, in the quiet control of his breathing, and in the steady, unwavering look he gave the flight attendant as she questioned him again and again. Some people confuse silence with weakness, but silence can be one of the strongest responses a person can offer, especially when the situation is charged with tension. He understood that his reaction wasn't only about this moment, it was about the message he would send to everyone watching. People were already turning their heads, pretending to scroll on their phones while secretly following the drama, waiting to see if he would snap or cause a scene. But he knew better. He knew the power of stillness, of refusing to let someone else's disrespect pull him into chaos. Instead of meeting her sharp tone with anger, he met it with clarity. When she asked for his ticket, he handed it to her without a word, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he wanted her to see her mistake for herself. When she questioned his seat assignment, he didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply pointed to the number printed right next to the window, the number that matched the ticket she was holding. And when she continued to insist that something must be wrong, he looked at her with the kind of patience that only someone who had been through situations like this many times could possess. It wasn't a new experience for him, it was a familiar pattern. But instead of reacting emotionally, he chose to respond with dignity. That kind of response takes discipline. It takes years of learning when to speak, when to stay silent, when to push back, and when to let someone's assumptions collapse under their own weight. The businessman understood that losing control, even for a second, could shift the narrative against him. He knew that the moment a black man raises his voice in frustration, people stop listening to what is right and start focusing on their own biases. So he refused to give anyone the excuse to misinterpret his intentions. He let the attendant expose her own behavior while he remained centered, grounded, and unshaken. But calmness didn't mean passivity. Underneath that composed exterior was a strength that came from experience, from achievement, and from an unshakable sense of self-worth. He wasn't trying to win an argument, he was maintaining his peace. He wasn't trying to humiliate her, he was letting her reveal the truth of the situation without him having to force anything. Every time she tried to question his legitimacy, he saw another layer of her assumptions peeling back. Every time he responded with steadiness, he gave her one more chance to recognize her own error. And each time she failed to see it, she moved closer to the moment when everything would come crashing down. His calm response also had an effect on the passengers around him. People who initially looked annoyed at what they thought might be a delay began to see what was really happening. They saw how he carried himself, how he refused to escalate, how he maintained his self-respect even while being singled out unfairly. And in those quiet moments, respect began to shift in the cabin. Some passengers who had stayed silent out of discomfort started to feel a sense of guilt. Others began to question why the attendant was treating him differently from everyone else. His demeanor didn't just protect his dignity, it changed the atmosphere of the entire plane. When the attendant finally began to sense that her authority wasn't producing the result she expected, she tried to disguise her frustration as professionalism. She straightened her posture, tightened her voice, and repeated that she was just doing her job. But he knew the difference between enforcing policy and enforcing prejudice. And the passengers did too. Still, he didn't challenge her with accusations. He didn't match her defensiveness with defensiveness. He simply waited. Sometimes the most powerful response is the one that forces someone else to confront their own behavior without being pushed. His calmness wasn't about letting her off the hook. It was about letting truth reveal itself naturally. His silence held weight, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he knew that the moment she discovered who he really was, everything would change. And he wanted her to feel the full impact of that realization without being able to blame it on his attitude or his tone. He wanted the lesson to be unmistakable, undeniable, and unforgettable. In choosing composure over conflict, he demonstrated a kind of power that can't be taught in training manuals or corporate seminars. It comes from character, from resilience, from a lifetime of learning to navigate moments where emotions run high and dignity is tested. His response was a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks in quiet firmness, in unbroken confidence, and in the moment authority and humility collided. At 30,000 feet didn't begin with raised voices or dramatic gestures, it began with something far quieter, far more human. The flight attendant believed she was in control. She believed her uniform, her training, and her position gave her the authority to question, command, and correct as she saw fit. And in many ways, that authority was real. She was responsible for order, safety, and proper seating. But authority without humility often loses its balance. It becomes rigid, defensive, and blind to the truth unfolding right in front of it. As she stood over the businessman, insisting he must have made a mistake, she was so focused on enforcing her own assumptions that she never stopped to consider the possibility that she was the one who needed correction. Meanwhile, humility sat calmly in seat 3A. The businessman didn't try to overpower the situation. He didn't flash his credentials, brag about his success, or use his status as a weapon. He didn't need to. Humility doesn't mean being small, it means being secure enough not to prove your worth to anyone who questions it. He watched her struggle with her own certainty, saw her wrestling with the gap between what she assumed and what the facts were trying to tell her, and he chose not to meet her force with force. His presence carried a quiet wisdom, the kind that comes from years of climbing ladders people never expected him to climb. He didn't need to announce who he was because he knew the truth would reveal itself in time. Still, moments like these create a tension in the air. On one side is someone convinced they're right. On the other side is someone who knows the truth but chooses not to weaponize it. The flight attendant's authority clashed with the businessman's humility in a way that made every second feel heavier. She kept pressing him, repeating that he must be mistaken, trying to maintain her sense of control even as the situation began slipping through her fingers. Passengers watched silently, sensing that something deeper than a seat assignment was taking place. They could feel the imbalance between how he was being treated and how he was choosing to respond. Every time she spoke, her voice tightened a little more. Her confidence had started as firm, almost harsh, but as she realized the businessman wasn't reacting the way she expected, that confidence began to crack. She expected anger or defensiveness. She expected frustration or confrontation. But his calmness, his steady composure, made her uncertainty louder. Authority is fragile when it rests on assumptions instead of truth. And the quieter he remained, the more obvious it became that she wasn't as in control as she believed. Humility, however, doesn't mean silence is easy. The businessman felt the sting of the moment. He felt the weight of being singled out yet again in a world where his success still wasn't enough to shield him from bias. But humility is a choice, and he chose not to let his emotions dictate his response. He chose to rise above the moment without diminishing the truth of what was happening. Humility gives a person the strength to endure disrespect without losing their dignity, and that strength was present in every breath he took, every calm answer he gave, every moment he refused to be provoked. As the tension built, the attendant's authority began to unravel. The more she insisted she was right, the more she revealed how much her authority depended on being unquestioned. But humility doesn't need to dominate to be powerful. It simply waits for the moment when truth becomes undeniable. And that moment came closer with every question she asked, every assumption she clung to, every time she failed to recognize the quiet confidence sitting right in front of her. Authority without humility blinds people to reality. It makes them believe that their perspective is the only one that matters. But humility sees the bigger picture. It understands context. It allows room for truth to emerge without forcing it. The businessman could have corrected her immediately. He could have pulled out evidence of who he was, shut the situation down instantly, and left her embarrassed from the start. But he didn't. He didn't want to win through humiliation. He wanted her to learn through realization. That is where humility becomes transformative. It gives others the chance to grow, even when they're in the wrong. As she finally stepped back, still convinced that she needed to verify his information, there was a moment when the entire cabin paused. A moment when authority and humility rested on opposite sides of a scale, waiting to see which would carry more weight. And though she didn't know it yet, the truth was already tipping that scale. The authority she clung to so tightly was about to collide with the humility he carried so quietly, and when those two forces meet, only one of them has the power to change hearts, shift perspectives, and reveal character in its truest form. Refusal to let someone else's disrespect pull you out of your truth. The moment the truth revealed the businessman's real identity didn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic declarations. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, like a curtain being drawn back on a stage where everyone had been watching the wrong scene. The flight attendant, still believing she was correcting a simple mix-up, walked toward the front of the cabin to verify his information. Her confidence seemed intact on the surface, but inside she wrestled with a sense that something wasn't adding up. The passengers watched her leave, their eyes shifting between her retreating figure and the businessmen sitting silently, composed, unbothered. It was in that silence that the truth began to make its quiet entrance at the front of the plane. The attendant approached the gate agent with the confidence of someone who expected quick validation. But as soon as she handed over the ticket and asked for confirmation, something in the gate agent's expression changed. The gate agent didn't look confused or concerned. Instead, they looked surprised that she was even asking. They explained that the man in seat 3A was not only correctly assigned, but also one of the airline's highest-tier elite members. Someone who flew more miles in a year than most people traveled in a decade. Someone who rarely needed to be questioned because the system already knew exactly who he was. The attendant felt the first crack in her certainty. Her authority, once solid, started to feel shaky. She asked for clarification, trying to mask her growing unease, and that's when the gate agent added something that shifted everything. They mentioned his name. And then, almost casually, they mentioned his position. He wasn't just a frequent flyer. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a well-known executive, a high-ranking leader of a company that had partnerships with the airline. A man whose contributions directly impacted the very industry she worked in. A man whose influence reached far beyond the cabin she was standing in. The reality hit her so suddenly that she felt the breath leave her chest on her walk back to the plane. Each step felt heavier than the last. The authority she'd held onto so tightly now felt like a weight she could barely carry. Passengers looked up as she approached, sensing the shift in her demeanor. Gone was the rigidity, the clipped tone, the defensive posture. In its place was a mix of shock, regret, and the sudden understanding that she had misjudged someone profoundly. The businessman saw her coming, but his expression didn't change. He remained composed, giving nothing away, allowing her to face the truth without softening. The moment she stopped beside his seat, and for the first time, her voice lacked the certainty it once had. She addressed him differently now, with a tone that attempted professionalism but couldn't hide the undercurrent of embarrassment. She offered explanations about needing to verify information, but the passengers knew, he knew, and deep down she knew that her behavior had nothing to do with policy. It had everything to do with perception. The kind of perception altered not by facts, but by judgment. The realization of who he was didn't just surprise her, it humbled her in a way she hadn't expected. Authority might give someone the power to question, but identity, true identity, carries its own weight. His success, his status, his achievements, all stood silently behind him like a quiet force that needed no introduction. And yet, he hadn't used any of it to demand respect. He had waited. He had allowed the moment to unfold naturally. He had given her every opportunity to recognize her mistake before the truth spoke for him. The shock spread through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged looks, silently acknowledging the injustice they had witnessed. Others lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with the knowledge that they had stayed silent when they could have said something. The businessman didn't revel in the shift. He didn't smirk or punish her with words. He simply acknowledged her apology with a calm nod, the same calmness he had carried through the entire ordeal. That moment of truth did something deeper than just correct a seating misunderstanding. It exposed the fragile foundation on which assumptions are built. It revealed how quickly people judge based on appearances, and how easily authority can turn into arrogance when humility is absent. And most importantly, it illuminated the gap between who the attendant assumed he was and who he actually turned out to be. The truth didn't embarrass him, it empowered him. It didn't diminish her, it revealed her. It reminded everyone watching that identity is more than clothing, more than skin, more than silent stereotypes. It is shaped by achievements, character, and dignity. And when the truth finally came to light, it didn't shout or demand attention. It simply arrived, undeniable and unshakable, transforming the entire atmosphere of the cabin in a single breath. The moment of public embarrassment didn't explode all at once, it unfolded slowly, like a spotlight gradually brightening on a truth that had been ignored for too long. When the flight attendant returned to the businessman's seat with a visibly changed demeanor, passengers who had pretended not to watch earlier now leaned in subtly, sensing something had shifted. Her posture, once stiff with authority, had softened. Her voice, once sharp and certain, now trembled with forced politeness. And it was in that contrast, between how she had treated him before and how she addressed him now, that the cabin truly saw the transformation taking place inside her. Public embarrassment has a unique power. It doesn't just expose what someone did wrong, it forces them to see themselves through the eyes of others. When she realized who he really was, she didn't just see a successful black businessman. She saw the weight of her own assumptions. She saw the moments where she had raised her voice unnecessarily, questioned him too aggressively, doubted him too quickly. And in that reflection, she saw the truth she had never taken the time to examine. Bias isn't always intentional, sometimes it's so deeply rooted that people don't realize it until the consequences shine too brightly to ignore. As she attempted to apologize, passengers observed the discomfort in her eyes. She offered explanations that didn't land, excuses that didn't erase the memory of her earlier behavior. She claimed she was following protocol, but everyone understood that her tone, her impatience, her disbelief had come from somewhere deeper than policy. She wasn't apologizing because of his title or rank, she was apologizing because the truth exposed her conduct, her assumptions, and her blind spots. And in that exposure, she experienced something she hadn't expected. Genuine shame. Embarrassment can push people in two directions, toward defensiveness or toward growth. In her case, the shock of realization thawed something inside her. She didn't have the luxury of hiding behind authority anymore. Authority hadn't protected her from her own bias, it had amplified it. And now the passengers who had watched silently were witnessing her vulnerability, her discomfort, and her recognition that she had misjudged someone simply because she had looked at him and decided he didn't belong. The businessman, still calm and composed, didn't gloat or push her further into humiliation. His silence didn't shame her, it taught her. His refusal to escalate earlier made her embarrassment even more powerful. If he had yelled, the moment could have been twisted into a conflict. If he had insulted her, she could have blamed the tension on his reaction. But because he had remained dignified throughout, the blame had nowhere else to go but back to her. The weight of that truth hit her harder than any confrontation could have. The other passengers experienced a transformation of their own. Some had watched without speaking up, sensing the unfairness but choosing silence. Now, seeing who he actually was, they felt a pang of guilt. They realized that their silence had contributed to the tension he endured. Public embarrassment doesn't just expose one person, it exposes a collective failure, the moments where people choose comfort over courage, observation over action. And in that cabin, several people silently recognized that they had been witnesses when they could have been allies. For the flight attendant, the shock created a moment of clarity she had long avoided. She realized that respect shouldn't be reactive, it shouldn't depend on status, wealth, race, or appearance. She had offered him respect only after learning who he was, not because she believed he deserved it from the start. That realization cut deep. It forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth that she had treated him differently before knowing anything about him. She had valued rank more than humanity, position more than dignity, perception more than truth. Public embarrassment, in its raw form, breaks down the walls people hide behind. It exposes what training sessions and company policies can't touch, the unspoken beliefs people carry inside themselves. For her, this moment would echo far beyond the flight. It would linger in her mind the next time she questioned someone too quickly. It would surface the next time she felt herself assuming something before speaking. And it would change the way she approached her role, not because she feared consequences, but because she understood the cost of her assumptions. The businessman didn't need to make a speech or correct her further. The truth had already done the work. His calmness had given her space to see the contrast between who she believed he was and who he turned out to be. And the embarrassment she felt wasn't punishment, it was enlightenment. It was the moment she realized that the lesson she had been forced to learn at 30,000 feet would stay with her long after the plane touched down, shaping not just her actions, but the way she saw people from that day forward. Lessons on dignity, respect, and emotional intelligence often arrive in moments people least expect, and this moment on the plane became one of those rare, defining experiences where truth, humility, and humanity intersected in a powerful way. The businessman didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. He didn't board the plane looking for conflict or hoping to make a point. He simply lived his truth, calm, confident, and grounded in a lifetime of earning his place in rooms where some people never expected him to stand. But the interaction that unfolded became a quiet classroom, one where the flight attendant, the passengers, and even the businessman himself rediscovered what human dignity really means. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition, and it doesn't rely on external validation. It's the steady awareness of one's worth, the inner strength that prevents a person from bending or breaking under someone else's judgment. The businessman embodied that dignity in every moment of the exchange. He didn't let frustration take over. He didn't allow disrespect to steal his composure. He didn't need to prove himself with titles or credentials. His restraint became a powerful reminder that dignity is not about how others treat you, it's about how you choose to respond. Respect, on the other hand, is a two-way mirror. It reflects the character of the person giving it just as much as the person receiving it. The flight attendant's initial lack of respect revealed more about her than it did about him. She treated him according to her assumptions, not his reality. But when the truth emerged, she realized that respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't rise or fall based on someone's appearance, wealth, or perceived status. True respect is given not because someone has earned it through accomplishments, but because they are human. Watching her struggle with that realization offered a profound lesson. Respect built on stereotypes is fragile, but respect built on humanity is unbreakable. Emotional intelligence plays an even deeper role in moments like this. It's the ability to regulate emotions, to understand the emotions of others, and to navigate tension without losing control. The businessman demonstrated emotional intelligence from the start. Instead of reacting with anger, he observed. Instead of escalating the conflict, he softened it with quiet confidence. Instead of proving his worth, he allowed the truth to unfold naturally. His emotional intelligence wasn't a strategy, it was a way of life shaped by countless experiences where he had to choose between reaction and reflection. And each time he chose reflection, he strengthened his capacity to rise above. For the flight attendant, emotional intelligence emerged only after embarrassment cracked open her perspective. She began to see the impact of her words, the weight of her assumptions, and the importance of self-awareness. Her realization became the first step toward growth. Emotional intelligence doesn't mean never making mistakes, it means learning from them so deeply that they reshape the way you behave in the future. In that moment, she understood that her authority didn't give her the right to judge, that her uniform didn't excuse her impatience, and that her job required not just enforcing rules but honoring the dignity of every passenger who stepped onto the plane. The passengers also learned something about themselves. Some felt guilty for watching silently. Others felt inspired by the businessman's composure. And a few realized that they, too, had their own biases, quiet, unspoken ones they had never confronted. Witnessing the shift from disrespect to recognition forced them to look inward, to question how they might have acted in her place, and to consider whether they had ever treated someone unfairly because of what they assumed. Lessons don't always come from being wrong, sometimes they come from observing wrongness and choosing not to repeat it. The broader lesson in this moment was that appearances are never the full story. The flight attendant saw a man who didn't fit her expectations of a first-class passenger, but she didn't see the years of hard work that earned him that seat. She didn't see the obstacles he had overcome or the achievements he carried quietly. Too often, society trains people to see the surface instead of the substance. But dignity and respect require looking deeper, withholding judgment, and recognizing that every person has a story that isn't visible at first glance. Another lesson was the transformative power of patience. The businessman's patience allowed the truth to emerge without conflict. It turned a potentially explosive situation into an opportunity for reflection. Patience doesn't mean allowing disrespect, it means choosing the right moment to let truth speak for itself. And in his silence, the cabin heard a louder message than anger could ever deliver. Finally, the encounter reminded everyone that growth often begins with discomfort. The flight attendant's embarrassment became her awakening. The passenger's silence became their reflection. The businessman's restraint became his strength. And together, these elements formed a moment that reached beyond the cabin, beyond the flight, beyond the misunderstanding. It became a reminder that humanity is always teaching, always nudging people back toward compassion, awareness, and the simple truth that every person deserves to be treated with dignity from the moment they walk through the door, no questions asked.